Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Okay, well, I think we could get started. I mean, people will still, I think, roll in. And then, of course, Emilia, since we're recording it, we have a lot of people that watch it later after we post it as well. So
Yes.
we have that. Well, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger, and I'm one of the co-hosts. I am a professor of history here at UT Austin, and also the rector of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the chair of our Slavic and Eurasian Studies department. Kirill?
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm thrilled. I'm excited. There is a new season, new semester. Welcome to the Spring 2023 Balkan Circle series, which is a very it's a big pleasure to say that we're having our third year in existence. You can watch our videos, and if you miss any of our exciting speakers, as one that we have today that I'll introduce in a second, please go ahead and look at our YouTube channel where you can watch the presentations later if you're unable to be live at the circle. Again, this season we are offering a wide variety of topics that will cover culture, history, everything Balkan. And today we are having a very exciting guest. It is a associate professor in political science, Emilia Zankina, who also is the interim vice provost for global engagement of Temple University and the dean of Temple University Rome campus. She holds a PhD in international affairs and a certificate in advanced East European studies from University of Pittsburgh. Her research examines democratization and elite transformation in Eastern Europe, but also populism, civil service reform, and gender political representation. She has published in reputable journals, and she's well known in our circles of professional and presses such as West European politics, politics and gender, East European politics, problem of post-communism, representation, ECPR Press, Indiana Press, and much more. She frequently serves as an expert for Freedom House, V Democracy, and EU Commission projects. In the past, Dr. Zankina has served as the provost of the American University in Bulgaria, also the associate director of the Center of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is also the managing editor of East European Politics and Societies and editor-in-chief of the newsletter of the Bulgarian Studies Association. She has a number of grants from IREX, ISL, American Council, Wilson Center, and much, much more. It's a very impressive CV. I had the pleasure of interacting in my previous role since now I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Texas. But as a vice rector of the New Bulgarian University, I had the pleasure to work with a highly ethical, innovative colleague. So thank you very much for being a guest and our opening speaker, Emilia. Today we'll be talking about Bulgarian-Turkish relations based on a research that you have published. And since the Bulgarian-Ukrainian war, since the Russia-Ukrainian war, put the region again on the map in terms of strategic importance, I believe that one of the elements of this puzzle is something that you will be addressing as well today. Please be our guest. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the flattering introduction and for the opportunity to join you today. And to Mary Newberg, ever since I started my research in a grad, and I was been a grad student, I have always been a huge fan. What you have written on Bulgaria has become seminal work. And Kirill, it is so nice to connect to you on the political science side and remembering fondly the wonderful projects we did together in Bulgaria. So really, really fun to be here among such notable people. I would start sharing my screen because I did prepare a presentation. And the presentation today would be based on an article I published recently, though I would also provide some more current some more current information. A delicate balancing act, Turkish-Bulgarian relations within the context of foreign and domestic politics. My main argument is that there are several factors that define those bilateral relations, and they happen at multiple levels. One of those levels is, of course, the EU-Turkish relations with Bulgaria as an EU member state, and Turkey being for decades now a candidate member, but of course the relationship between the EU and Turkey being very, very important for the EU. And Bulgaria as an agent in this dynamic. Second, I look at the domestic politics in Bulgaria and the way the relationship with Turkey is constructed and exploited by various domestic political actors for various purposes. And lastly, also how those relationships play into Erdogan and Turkey's domestic politics, and in which way, in fact, they have been able to benefit Erdogan personally and beyond. Moving on, just a second. Okay. So just a little overview of what we're talking about. You see that as for the latest census, we did see with the latest census a decrease in the population of Bulgaria, which is now under 7 million. And the Turkish population went from 8.8 in the previous census of 2011 to 8.4. But we see also that just there's an overall decline. And so this is quite a sizable minority among the highest ethnic fractionalizations within the EU we see in Bulgaria, which makes, of course, this minority very, very crucial in every way. A little bit about the Bulgarian ethnic Turks. You do see that they have, the Bulgarian ethnic Turks are predominantly rural, whereas the other dominant groups, Bulgarians, are over 75% urban, and the Roma are about 50% urban. So you're talking about a predominantly rural population, half of the population is concentrated mainly in two cities, Kırjali and Razgrad. So one on the south east on the way to actually Istanbul, the closest to Turkey, and the other one close to Romania, up in Razgrad. But you also see other cities, Târgoviște, Silistra, Shumen. So you have in Kırjali and Razgrad, in fact, the Turkish population is higher, is the highest, is the majority population, whereas in the other cities, it can constitute anywhere between 20 to 30, 35%. You also see differences in education levels. Being rural population, you see that compared to Bulgarians, the education level, higher ed, and also high school, it is much lower than the dominant ethnic group. You do see that you have the Turkish language not actually being spoken by all ethnic Turks. So you have ethnic Turks who identify as ethnic Turks, but whose mother tongue is Bulgarian. And of course, this is a function of the long history. Very importantly, you have about 1 million Bulgarian ethnic Turks in Turkey living there, and at least 90,000 of them active voters who voted in Turkey in the latest elections. So this is in addition to any of them who actually traveled to the country to vote in Bulgarian elections in Bulgaria. And so this is a sizable minority of ethnic Turks, Bulgarian ethnic Turks in Turkey, who over there ironically are called Bulgarian Turks. They're a little bit in no man's land. So what is the history of this ethnic Turkish population? Of course, 5 centuries of Ottoman presence, domination with Bulgaria, what is today Bulgaria being part of the Ottoman Empire. And at the time of the liberation, after the Berlin Congress, you have 20 to 25% of Turkish population still in the country, and 30% of Muslim population, because you also have a lot of ethnic Bulgarians who were converted to Islam during this Ottoman period. Initially, there were a lot of population transfers. So the idea was that with the establishing of those borders, you would create ethnically pure countries, and we know that on the in the Balkans, this often took quite forceful ways. Turks were basically expelled from Bulgaria, but we also see similar expelling of Turks from Greece and of Greeks from Turkey. So you had during that period of independence significant population transfers that were handled in various ways. On the one hand, there was some bipartisan agreements for those. On the other hand, it was simply bad treatment of those minorities in the home countries. So you have, since these population transfers didn't clean, so to say, Bulgaria enough of Turks, you had a period of the so-called hegemonic control, and this is this is research by Veselin Dimitrov, excellent research on those various strategies. The idea being that ethnic Turks, of course, would be allowed to live in the country, but they would be kept at inferior positions. So they would be allowed to practice their language, practice their culture, practice their religion. And in that way, by granting them this freedom of identity, actually they would be kept as the other, and they would be dominated by the ethnic Bulgarians. There have been later also with the coming of Atatürk in Turkey, there was some attempts for bipartisan arbitration, additional population transfers, but also some treaties for protection of minorities in each country and for the preservation and guaranteeing of rights. You also had integration on a non-ethnic principle during the communist period, something that I'll say a little bit more about, and a very, very shameful period towards the late years of communist rule in Bulgaria of forced assimilation. So during the communist era, the communist regime still found the country with a sizable ethnic population located especially in those areas that I outlined. And initially the idea was that we would convert any minorities, any ethnicities into the international ideal of a socialist man. So with socialism and the idea of internationalism, it didn't matter what your ethnic belonging or identity was. It was important that you are abiding by communist ideology and those principles. So some religious and cultural freedom was nevertheless granted. So for a period at least, there was Turkish being allowed in schools in those regions and the practice of religion. But you know, most of those were strongly suppressed. Religion also, not only for ethnic Turks, religion was suppressed, period. So the idea was that religion is outdated and communist ideology was supposed to replace religion. There was still some forced migration, especially during the period of land collectivization, when everybody, but including ethnic Turks, lost a lot of land. So there was another wave of migration. And then another wave in the late 60s and 70s, when you also had some forced assimilation campaigns, including violence and killings of ethnic Turks in some regions. Ironically, this assimilation on non-ethnic principle and attempt to raise the living standards of ethnic Turks did not make them more socialist. It actually strengthened the ethnic identity. And this was later on exploited to present Turks as a threat, also because of the higher birth rate and their culture, language, and tradition. So aside from those mini assimilation campaigns that were carried out through this time, we have the so-called renaming or revival process. So in Bulgarian, this is called Возрожденски process. It's almost like you could be even translated as Renaissance. So it was based on the idea of redefining the Bulgarian nation. And throughout the 60s and the 70s, we started seeing those tendencies, but particularly they were exploited by the Zhivkov regime in the late years of this regime with political purposes, arguing basically that ethnic Turks were not Turks, that they were in fact ethnic Bulgarians who had lost touch with their Bulgarian identity due to the forced conversion to Islam during the Ottoman period. So we need to help them revive their identity, which of course meant renaming. So we're talking about renaming 800,000 people at the time, in addition to banning any religious practices, burial rituals, for example. So there's a lot of horror stories during that period of ethnic Turks having a regular funeral and then returning at night to excavate the body and bury it in the according to the Muslim ritual and do this playing back and forth. Heavy presence of security services in those communities at the time. This was largely an elite-led process, initiated single-handedly, certainly by Todor Zhivkov, but carried out by those security services. And there were several international factors and domestic factors that led to why this happened at this particular moment. So you had, on the one hand, the splitting of Cyprus and a military coup in Turkey, as well as the Kurdish problem, which assured some kind of Soviet backing to anything that concerned Turkey. So if Zhivkov was about to move in this direction, it felt like, at least initially, not after Gorbachev came, but at least initially, he could have felt like there would have been support by the Soviet Union. And of course, at that time, the Bulgarian regime was one of the most dependent on Moscow, frequently named Moscow's most trusted ally. We also have some domestic factors. What came to be known as the Movement for Rights and Freedoms and its leader, Ahmet Dogan, at the time had already organizations who were engaging in terrorist activity in 1983 and 1994. So there were a couple of bombings at train stations, and there were some people dead. So there was certainly a possibility to be framing this minority as a threat. Most importantly, was the declining legitimacy of the Zhivkov regime with the economic stagnation and perestroika coming on and having more open critique towards this regime. Thus, Zhivkov embarking on this nationalist policy in an attempt to divert attention from domestic issues, not unlike what some may argue Putin has done with Crimea and now with Ukraine. And glasnost and perestroika, which opened the door for open criticism, which was in line with the Soviet directives, but was allowing dissidents, rising dissident voices, not organized dissidents in Bulgaria until 1988, but in those earlier years, the possibility to criticize Zhivkov while, abiding by the Soviet line of glasnost and perestroika. So this renaming process culminated with very dramatic events in 1989. So after renaming these people, and I have a lot of friends who can show me documents that have three different names. So you have them born, let's say Ahmed Ahmedov, and then they become Ilia Iliev, and after the end of communism, they're allowed to actually return to a real Turkish name without "of" or "f" at the end. A notable example I like to quote is Yıldız Ibrahimova, who is a famous singer, was married to the mayor of Istanbul, one of the mayors of Istanbul. So Yıldız Ibrahimova, a very famous jazz singer, was renamed to Suzana Erova. Imagine, I mean, this is a quite dramatic change. So all of this assimilation and renaming process, which also included erasing names on on tombstones, and placing Bulgarian names on those tombstones, led to already protests within the country. In fact, the first organized protests in the country were not by Bulgarian dissidents. Certainly, we did have some protests in Ruse, on ecological matters in '88, but the first large protests were in fact organized by the ethnic Turks who were protesting this renaming process. So the way that Zhivkov reacted to this was to in fact open the borders. So if Bulgaria had closed the borders and you couldn't leave the country because you did need an exit visa to be allowed to leave the country, and actually visiting Turkey for ethnic Turks, Bulgarian ethnic Turks, was among the hardest things to do. It was much easier to visit East Germany or to visit the Soviet Union, but not Turkey. So he opened the borders, and you had this dramatic humanitarian crisis with 350,000 people piling at the borders. And initially Turkey taking them in, but at some point this becoming untenable, very much like the Syrian refugee crisis that we witnessed not long ago, and Turkey closing the borders. So you have this period over the summer where you have people stuck in no man's land. They have already emptied their houses, they have left their job, they have packed their cars or carts or whatever they have, and they're hoping to go to Turkey, and Turkey closes the borders, and Zhivkov and the regime, of course, start exploiting that, accusing ethnic Turks who work mostly in the agricultural sector of failing purposefully the harvesting season and condemning their compatriots to starvation. Houses that they left in property were plundered. They were often appropriated by the Secret Service police. So if those people were to return, they no longer had their property. So the so-called Great Excursion was truly a dramatic event that caused an international outcry and a special UN session. And it is by that time already, the personal relationship between Gorbachev and Todor Zhivkov that never existed really fell apart. And you saw the loss of Soviet support and Gorbachev publicly criticizing Zhivkov and his renaming process. So a special UN session was held in August of '89, and ultimately this tragic policy and events had the only positive thing probably that they had, that they really harmed the legitimacy of Zhivkov and the communist regime and became a key factor in the collapse of this regime at that particular time in 1989. So what happens after that? The Communist Party, that is to rename itself to a Socialist Party, apologized publicly early on in the winter of 1990. and allowed the reversal of the names. You had, but the reversal of the names and the rehabilitation of the ethnic Turks, in fact, was coupled with anti-ethnic protests in January of 1990. Surprisingly, one of the leaders of those protests was Georgi Parvanov, later on a Bulgarian president and a quite respected political figure of the Socialist Party. You also have the MRF controversy, so the Movement for Rights and Freedoms being an ethnic party, when the new constitution created in the summer of 1990 explicitly banned ethnic parties. But of course, MRF was registered and the issue went to the Constitutional Court, and ultimately it was allowed to run in elections and be part of the 1991 parliament. You also have a lot of scholars like Antonina Zhelyavskova, for example, talk about the Bulgarian ethnic model and this legacy of peaceful coexistence and ethnic tolerance during the Ottoman rule. Now, we can certainly not deny the fact that the Ottoman Empire was truly eclectic, both ethnically and religiously, and the Millet system, which did not call for geographic separation, allowed multiple ethnic communities to cohabitate in the same geographic territory, something that then really became a problem with the collapse of the empire. But you take a city like Thessaloniki, for example, you had the Bulgarian Millet, the Turkish Millet, the Greek Millet, and so forth, and all of those layers within the same geographic. So certainly there was a lot of interaction among those ethnicities. The Sephardic Jews, of course, were housed after the Inquisition in the Ottoman Empire. So certainly the idea of a Bulgarian ethnic model where there's no escalation of ethnic tension and ethnic violence does hold true, though there are a lot of people from this community that would disagree because they did experience violence and suppression. But we do have to also admit that this never reached the scale of the Yugoslav wars. So currently, and I'll talk more about also politically, currently you have political representation that is the MRF of ethnic Turks, but still quite weak social integration and high levels of unemployment. You also saw the demographic data, so rural and less educated population. And we also have seen in recent years, especially in the third Borisov government with nationalists being junior coalition partners, an increased intolerance both towards the ethnic Turks and the Roma minorities. So the MRF has become quite a controversial party, though it is among the longest standing parties in Bulgaria's democratic history, and one probably that has the most solid party structures, including youth organizations and professional development opportunities. So it is a really tightly run party, really a model of how you can organize a party and keep it under control. But it is anything but a democratic party for the longest time. Of course, it was equivalent to Ahmed Dugan, who is now an honorary chair and has passed on the baton. But you know, this party, given its controversial registration and existence as an ethnic party, managed to monopolize the ethnic Turkish vote, both in Bulgaria and Bulgarian ethnic Turks, Bulgarian citizens in Turkey. And despite various attempts to form other parties, we have several such attempts early on that led to nowhere, and then most recent attempts, this vote was never split. So the MRF to this day captures at least 90% of the ethnic Turkish vote. MRF is often given credit by many politicians. I would quote here our first democratically elected Prime Minister, Philip Dimitrov, who gives a lot of credit to Ahmed Dugan that during the wars in Yugoslavia, he did not exploit the opportunity for escalation of ethnic tensions, and in fact was collaborative and did not play the ethnic card. Others would argue that this was at the expense of course, the MRF and Erdogan and Dogan himself, being much focused on economic matters and dealings, illegal dealings. So he talks. Dogan is known for his circle of firms, and the corruption accusations of MRF have existed for long, but have particularly been a point in the political discourse in the last 10 years. We had the scandal in 2013 when this controversial figure, Delian Peevski, a media mogul who controls the entire distribution of media publications throughout the country, the print distribution, was appointed or attempted to be appointed as head of the National Security Service, which spurred 2 years of protests in 2013. Most recently, we have seen some newer parties, Hristo Ivanov and Da Bulgaria, stage spectacular operations, showing up at Dogan's house on the beach, which includes sort of illegally misappropriated beach, and in fact there's no access through land. So Hristo Ivanov and a bunch of activists showed by boat and landed on the beach with cameras and so forth. So this became another controversial moment that actually triggered the most recent protests of 2021 that led to yet another wave of protest. Another sin that the MRF is often accused of is the so-called voting tourism. That is the multiple buses that come from Turkey to Bulgaria on election day, and you have these people who hold Bulgarian passports and can legitimately, of course, vote either in Turkey in the Bulgarian sections there or in Bulgaria. But you know, of course, drawing attention by the fact that you have this massive move over a few days with the purpose of voting. And then something I'll talk about more recently, the relationship between the MRF and Erdogan, which has shifted back and forth. I'll mention this in a bit. Most interestingly, the latest developments that in December 2022, you had multiple visits just last month, first by President Radev, then by the chair of the parliament, Vizhdi Rashidov, then by the interior minister and of the caretaker government, and by Mustafa Karadaya, the head of the MRF. So this is always interesting that every time you have elections either in Turkey or in Bulgaria, you start seeing these visits, and between before the previous elections, Bulgaria has had 4 in the last 18 months, and it's about to have a 5th one in the next 6 months for sure. Borisov himself, Boyko Borisov, the 3-time prime minister of Bulgaria until not long ago, visited also Erdogan. So some of the issues today in gas from Turkey, Borisov was accused of spending 3 million of Bulgarian tax money on converting the so-called South Stream and calling it first Balkan Stream, but then Turkish Stream, a pipeline that was supposed to diversify Bulgaria's energy policy, but it ultimately allowed as many critics would argue, additional supply of Russian gas through Turkey. So most recently, a 13-year contract was signed between Bulgargas and the Turkish counterpart, national Turkish company. And Rade's visit to Turkey actually intended to cement this agreement. Control of the border, something that has been since the 2015 migration crisis has been an issue, but with Bulgaria most recently being denied membership into Schengen, while Croatia already is part of Schengen as of this month, with Austria in particular raising concerns about Bulgaria's ability to control the border. And so you had this focus on controlling the border and courting Erdogan, who has been, what you could argue, has been very cooperative, because the millions of refugees staying in Turkey are a weapon that he could release at any moment onto Europe, and he has been holding this as a card, of course, and using it for political clout. And so Rashid, the chair of the parliament, another controversial figure, most recently tried to portray yet again, after Borisov had done that before, Bulgaria is a mediator at the EU level. Following his visit, he invited the Turkish delegation to Bulgaria for an exchange visit. And proposed another EU-Turkey summit in addition to the one in 2018, I believe it was, another EU-Turkey summit to be again mediated by Bulgaria on issues of migration, border control, and visas. So looking into those three factors, on the one hand, you have EU-Turkish relations and Bulgaria in between. At the geostrategic level, Turkey was among the first supporters for Bulgarian membership into NATO. So Turkey at the time, after the collapse of communism, immediately proclaimed that Bulgaria must be part of NATO, and it did exercise influence for that to happen. Similarly, Bulgaria has gone through stages, but for a prolonged period, Bulgaria had been a supporter of EU membership to Turkey, especially before Erdogan's time. You also have very close trade relations between the two countries. Turkey is the 5th largest partner and the largest non-EU partner, and a prime tourist destination for Bulgarians. You do have this relationship that many have speculated about between Erdogan and Borisov. Borisov portraying himself as the person, the person among EU leaders who can talk to Erdogan and who can put sense into him. So he has repeatedly helped Erdogan at the EU level and domestically. Following the Gülen coup, he extradited a couple of Gülenists, Turkish opposition figures. He did hold a EU-Turkey summit on March 2018 during Bulgaria's presidency. Of the EU, which Donald Tusk declared to be a complete failure in terms of actual results accomplished. But nevertheless, the summit was held in Varna, and it was seen as a big success in bringing EU and Turkey together, and Borisov facilitating that. In addition, Borisov had supported Erdogan on various matters. So, for example, when the EU criticizes Erdogan and Turkey for not keeping its end of the deal on migration, or when Macron was criticizing Erdogan over the response to the caricature scandal. Most recently, the oil drilling near Cyprus conflict, Germany, and so Angela Merkel and Borisov were in opposition to EU sanctions towards Turkey. And of course, what I already mentioned, the so-called Turkish stream, and the domestic infrastructure extension that benefits Turkey and Russia. So in other words, Bulgaria and Borisov in particular, and currently also Radev and the caretaker government have been actively protecting, in a way, Turkey's interest at the EU level, with the argument that they are mediators and they act as agents of dialogue, and portraying Bulgaria as being particularly well positioned because of the cultural and historical ties and heritage to be the country leading that dialogue. You have then a second element, which is Turkey as a factor in Bulgarian politics. What we need to understand that Bulgarian policy towards Turkey is always determined in the context of the ethnic Turkish minority. So the fact that we have this minority, the fact that we have an ethnic Turkish party, could never be divorced from any decisions taken in our bilateral relations from Bulgarian politicians. And by the same token, any moves on the side of Turkey or by Erdogan or any other politician are always seen and interpreted by at least some domestic political actors as an attempt to interfere with domestic politics in Bulgaria. So it is impossible that a visit happens to Turkey, or there's a Turkish delegation in Bulgaria, or that anything is said or done without this frame of reference being imposed on the bilateral relations. So Erdogan has been accused of meddling in domestic politics, and there's a long history there. So at some point, we had a situation when Erdogan was banned from entering Turkey. Ahmed Dogan, the leader of MRF, was banned from entering Turkey because of defending taking a pro-Russian position in the dispute between Russia and Turkey on a fallen airplane. And at that particular moment, Erdogan put a ban on Dogan entering the country, and by contrast, supported Lutfi Mestan, who was Ahmed Dogan's second man in command in his new political venture called DOST. So in fact, Erdogan publicly endorsed Lutfi Mestan and his new party. To no avail, Mestan did not manage to gather even 1% of the vote. But you know, following this dynamic, most recently, and especially after seeing that an alternative ethnic Turkish party cannot take root, Erdogan returned his support for MRF, appearing most recently at the 2020 Party Congress, right, with upcoming elections, which is unprecedented to have in Bulgaria. It is unprecedented to have a party congress that at which a third country leader delivers a video message and addresses publicly the delegates. So this was something that was widely criticized by President Radev and, of course, nationalist parties that really showed very, very direct interference in party matters and therefore in domestic politics. You also have a diaspora, the Turkish diaspora, and of course the MRF greatly relies on the cooperation of the Turkish authorities to organize the voting sections, to facilitate voting. So this is another important element for domestic politicians to maintain good relations, especially MRF politicians. Then you have, by the same token, nationalist parties, and not only, who benefit from the ethnic Turkish minority and the bilateral relations to construct nationalist discourse vilifying the MRF and Turkey, equating Turkey, the ethnic Turks, and the Emirates, sort of lumping everything together. And surprisingly, it's not surprising that nationalist parties would do that, but also we see this from the БСП, a party that, of course, if we look at the entire history of the party, has is the party that carried out the renaming process, President Radev as well. So you have, for example, spectacular operations such as one leader of a nationalist party, Valery Semyonov, appearing at the border on the day of elections and trying to stop buses at the border from entering to prevent the so-called voting tourism, also encouraging the beating of migrants who may be border crossing, accusing Turkey. Another scandal in a speech by the foreign minister who mentioned that Bulgaria is part of the spiritual boundaries of the Ottoman Empire. So, of course, statements like this are immediately exploited in Bulgarian politics for political purposes. Lastly, we have Bulgaria and the way it could benefit Erdogan in particular, and it could be a factor in domestic politics. So there's a very interesting dynamic. You would think that, the Bulgarian population is negligent in terms of the size, the overall size of the voting population in Turkey. But actually, the northwest of the country, with Istanbul, of course, you have the largest opposition to Erdogan, with the Republican People's Party being prominently supported, and Erdogan and his AKP party having difficulty getting foot in this part of the country. And this is where Bulgarian Turks are concentrated primarily, who have traditionally always voted for the Republican People's Party. During this fallout between Erdogan and Dogan and the MRF, also the MRF was publicly advocating against the 2017 referendum, the constitutional amendments that Erdogan was able to push through. So the MRF advocated with ethnic Turks to vote against. So you have a population that could be mobilized to vote for or against Erdogan, and both sides, of course, on both sides of the border, this is very well known and exploited. And then you have something less tangible, but not less important. Erdogan's the so-called neo-Ottomanist rhetoric that targets domestic audiences, but goes beyond domestic audiences in order to portray this pan-Turkic and neo-Ottoman framework. So, for example, Erdogan has exploited such rhetoric in countries like Germany. He had a very interesting and widely watched visit in Sarajevo. So talking about and emphasizing this common Muslim identity and Ottoman past. People like Dimitar Bechev argue that, of course, he's not trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire, because Turkey hardly has the resources today to recreate this empire, but rather that he's using this to cater to domestic audiences who are sympathetic with this pan-Turkic rhetoric, and which rhetoric also has a therapeutic effect in a country where you still have not had a conversation and reconciliation of the Ottoman past. So glorifying that past allows many Turks to feel okay about their identity and to reconcile modern-day Turkey with the Ottoman Empire in what becomes a long and coherent history. And Erdogan has been very, very successful in playing on that emotional note. But Bechev also argues, and within that, of course, Bulgarian Turks are part of this pan-Turkic community, just like the Bosnians, the Albanians, and so forth. But Bechev also argues that, in fact, we see here a shift from multilateralism to bilateralism in foreign relations. And I would say before the war in Ukraine, which has united the EU in many, many ways, you have seen rising Euroscepticism, of course, Brexit happening at the same time. So Erdogan actually making a strategic shift, very much like Putin, in fact, towards bilateral relations that allow him to achieve his objectives much more easily, also within the EU, than through this multilateral cooperation. Almost done, finished here with conclusions. So if there's anything that characterizes Bulgarian and Turkish relations, it is complexity. It is multi-layered and it is complex, and it is what I call shades of gray. On the one hand, you have bilateral relations, but then you have the EU level relations within those bilateral relations, and you have domestic audiences on both sides of the border that are exploited or that are catered to through various discourses and political dynamics. You also have this love-hate attitude in Bulgaria towards Turkey that is very interesting. You have these nationalist attitudes of the massacres, the Turkish massacres, but then this fascination with Turkish soap operas and Turkey being the prime destination for tourism, Turkish restaurants being widely attended and present in Bulgaria. So it is a problematic relationship for Bulgarians to think about how they perceive Turkey as a country, but also culturally and as a legacy in Bulgaria. You have Erdogan's use of soft power with this pan-Turkic rhetoric and his renewed engagement in the Balkans, with the main purpose of legitimizing himself domestically, as Bechev argues, but again, Bulgaria being a player in that. And then you have some very objective challenges, very real challenges that Bulgaria has. On the one hand, it's a powerful neighbor. Turkey has the largest military in the region, holds a couple of million of refugees that could be released through Bulgaria. It is an economic power. It is a naval power. So you have a neighbor that you must reconcile with. You could not afford to not get along with. At the same time, you have to maintain good ethnic relations at home and balance, this bilateral relations in a way that don't lead to ethnic escalation and don't leave too much room to nationalist parties to exploit the Turkish minority and Turkish relations for electoral gains. And third, you also have to abide by EU-level decisions. And anything that comes as a European directive, and especially specific sanctions against Turkey and the EU-level relations, especially on energy and migration. So certainly it is a delicate balance that Bulgaria is a much smaller, much poorer, much less well-resourced country must deal with this powerful neighbor. But I would like to end on a positive note, because in recent years, of course, we have spent so much time talking about authoritarianism, and we have certainly seen this shift both in Russia in the last 2 decades and in Turkey in the last decade, and in Hungary and other places. So we are all too quick to declare this democratic backsliding and shift towards authoritarianism. But we also need to keep in mind that even in the current state of Turkey, with Erdogan holding almost absolute power, it is still the most democratic Muslim country that exists. and certainly in that region. And it is our gate to a relationship with the Muslim world that is on the terms of Western civilization. You also have a highly educated population in many parts of the country, certainly not all parts of the country, that you have a long tradition of democracy. So we should question to what extent Turkey and Erdogan are equivalent, whether Erdogan would ever step down from power, and whether the democratic resilience and culture in this country could lead to a shift towards a more democratic society. I'll end here. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we should have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Emilia. I'm thrilled and specifically I'm thankful to you for this panoramic overview of Bulgaria or post-war and Cold War Bulgarian-Turkish relations, which I absolutely would agree with you. They're very complex, very traumatic, multiple layers of trauma, of misunderstanding, conflict, and resolution. And I certainly have several questions and comments, but I'll invite first my colleagues to address in the circle, and then make several remarks, and actually ask your take on several important things which I've noticed actually were present in your presentation, which have quite serious bearing, I would argue, for the region and the strategic orientation, bearing in mind that we are the southern flank of NATO and on the forefront of possibly a new migration pressure and a wave. Mary?
Well, I have a lot of questions. I mean, as you know, my first book was on The Orient Within, was on Turks and also Pomaks in Bulgaria. And actually, I wrote that book in the 90s and did the research for that book in the 90s. And it was actually, people were pretty hostile towards me working on that topic, or I think in general, people working on that topic. And it was very difficult actually working in the archives, and people just kept asking me in Bulgaria, why are you writing about that? Like, why why do you want to say bad things about Bulgaria? That kind of thing. I had to remind them that actually in the US we have a much darker history in terms of our relationship to our minority populations. But I guess so. This is just kind of throwing a monkey wrench in it a little bit. Like, all of this was great. It's such a complex relationship. I'm wondering though, like, if you could talk a little bit about the sort of American thread or dynamic of this. So when I was working on that topic at that time in the 90s, and the US, of course, first supported Bosnia and Bosnian Muslims in that war, later supported Kosovar, Albanians in that war. And so Bulgarians were basically saying to me, oh yeah, no, the US has always supported Turkey, thinking about NATO. They're trying to carve a green corridor through the Balkans. There was this idea that US was this huge supporter of Islam in the Balkans. And I was like, no, we have actually, some of that's, I guess, true, but it's not that we're some big, supporters of Islam globally, but we were kind of put in that sort of role or position, at least from people's perspective in the Balkans in the 90s. I'm just wondering, since then, I guess the other dynamic is that the US and the West has always been a kind of basically pressured Bulgaria to treat its Muslim minorities better, funneled money for grants and scholarships and aid for minority populations, or to study them. So there's that. It seems to be this agenda coming from the West and from the outside. You could say even in the Treaty of Berlin, there were all kinds of stipulations about how you have to treat your minorities. And so I'm just wondering about that dynamic, this idea that the West is trying to sort of tell Bulgaria what to do in terms of its own minorities, even though it's not necessarily the best with its own, and kind of how that plays into this relationship that you outline here so well. And thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you, Mary. You're making an excellent point that I actually omitted one important aspect of this talk because it would have become just out of control. But what you talk about leads actually to the reaction to it, which is Russia. So you're absolutely right that indeed there was and still is. So initially there was a big resistance and backlash against USAID, against all those Americans coming to democratize us from outside. And then the war really in Yugoslavia, especially the bombings of Belgrade, this really was a shocker to many Bulgarians, who of course forget all the nasty wars we had with the Serbians, conveniently forgotten. But all of a sudden, they started talking about pan-Slavism and Orthodox brothers. And of course, Russia is the defender of this pan-Slavism and Orthodox brothers. And the US is the one that is forcing all of those made-up countries such as Kosovo, and similarly, pressuring us to give more to protect human rights of all the minorities. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it is indeed a big part of framing this discourse. And it actually became the basis for the appearing of nationalist parties, which in Bulgaria happened relatively late with Ataka in 2005. But the reason why it happened so late is because these discourses before that were monopolized by the БСП. So the БСП, unlike many other former communist parties, was also nationalist. So you had this red-brown rhetoric and vote. So, but the moment that БСП in 2001 is accepted into the Socialist International and adopts a real, a social democratic platform, this niche is opened. And so you have parties like Ataka, who I find paradoxical but very logical in the Bulgarian context, defending Russian interests. So every time you heard Russia on the news, Volin Sidorov would start yelling. It was like pressing a button. You say Russia and Volin Sidorov starts defending. And of course, БСП to this day continues to defend Russia. So opposing arms to Ukraine, opposing expelling of Russian diplomats. So I would say that this certainly in the 90s started, but I would say that today is very much present. And it is framed differently, could be framed differently, but essentially is, are we slaves to Russia or are we slaves to the US? And how do Turkish relations and ethnic relations factor into that? And the war in Yugoslavia really made that, accentuated this. But yes, thank you for mentioning this, because it is a very, very important part of the discourse today.
Thank you for that. Kirill, do you want to ask some of your questions?
Yes, I would like to address actually three things which I found and kind of build off where you started, about kind of the image of sort of the West and Bulgarian, parties, which unfortunately in a smaller country's politics, it's part of the political strategies of playing this and accusing of parties being proxies for different other countries. And of course, Bulgaria has this long tradition of Russophilia versus Russophobia, which dates back to the liberation. However, I would like to provoke you, Emilia, with several things that came to mind while looking at your slides. One, I believe that everyone who's been following Bulgarian politics and is Bulgarian analyst would agree that one of the kind of the big phrases that came out at the dawn of democracy came from Ahmed Dogan. Literally, Bulgaria's way to Europe goes through the Bosphor. Kind of a famous saying that was really hotly debated back in the day. My question is, when you have shown us the slide, which I really do appreciate, I'll actually be using it for my classes. the overview of later Bulgarian cabinets, such as Borisov's, and
Yes.
his casting himself as indispensable tool of Europeans to speak to the leader of Turkey, kind of mano a mano, this really matches figures with all the bagage that goes, real or perceived, who can advocate and as you really used really kind of interesting and I would agree term, talking sense, to the Pasha, that we're able to do deals and we kind of last resort, whether we'll bring in presents or whatever. It's kind of long tradition, right, in going to Istanbul or Ankara and trying to please them. So my question is my first question is this phrase, that Dogan has uttered like way back, is it gaining a new validity? Because as you mentioned, as cycles come and go in both countries, this climbs very high on the agenda, and everyone's very mindful, of what's going on, be it threats for one way or another. So this is my first. Should we revisit this phrase? Number two, what do you make out of this paradox? Just mind-boggling in my opinion, and I want to hear your comment that MRF, in fact, is a part of ALDE family. I mean, they are liberal.
Yes.
Which everyone who's been following again, closely the region and Bulgarian politics in particular, would know that one of the most probably undemocratic parties plagued by corruption scandals and all kinds of abuses of power, real or perceived, but some of the scandals are well documented, are precisely, MRF's modus operandi on capitalizing on the so-called ethnic model that you have, and Antonina is talking about, and a number of other scholars of our colleagues. And number three, and I want you to comment like this, just what's the view from Brussels? Like, are people not cognizant of the modus operandi, especially of the honorary? He's a hydrologist as well, to my understanding as well, not only a philosopher, when it comes to public procurement money. And number three is, what do you think the accusations that rocked Bulgarian society and scandals that literally took all of us on the street? And I'm not going to hide that I was biased in 2013, as well as our colleagues from the University of Sofia. It was like all of us are danced with me, on the street. What do you make of this heavy accusation that the Bulgarian Turkish party in its ethnic Turkish party in its current iteration is actually an ethnic corporation, which is benefiting from the political process without returning anything in terms of political representation, or in very clientelistic kind of anachronistic models of keeping people in their places, up to the absurd examples we have heard in certain localities in Bulgaria, where actually some of our students will be going and researching this year, where you cannot hold the job of kindergarten teacher without the approval, or to receive the position without the local party leader. And we're talking about 21st century EU. So thank you. I know it was lengthy, but I just wanted to make sure.
Maybe we take also the question from Christian, because I'm mindful of the time,
Yes.
so that I could then include that.
Yeah, sure. Christian, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Just a second. Firstly, thank you for your very, general overview over the Turkish-Bulgarian relations. So I'm actually a historian and archivist, so because of that, I'm not familiar. Of course, that I'm in some kind familiar because I read a lot of newspapers here in Bulgaria. So I have some points about the political situation here, but as historian, I'm much more curious about other issues. So I have two questions. First is about what is your opinion about the particularly Turkish policy over the, Ottoman cultural heritage here in Bulgaria, not economic issues, not political issues, but particularly over the historical heritage of Turkey. And the second question is not historical after all. I'm just curious about your. Excuse me. I'm just curious about your opinion about the results of the elections this year. Can you give us some kind of forecast, predictions of what we should expect from these elections?
Yeah.
And the third one is that I want to share that I'm not quite objective about the Bulgarian-Turkish relationship because I'm, how to say, a big fan of, big supporter of the Turkish culture. I like to be in Turkey to drink black tea and so on, to speak in Turkish and to lurk in their archives. So because of that, I'm not quite objective, but my personal opinion is that we should have a very good relationship with Turkey. I mean, the Bulgarian state should have a very good relationship. And I would choose that opportunity to invite you at the National Library in Bulgaria when you are here in Sofia to show you a lot of Ottoman Turkish documents which we have preserved here in Sofia. So thank you.
Thank you very much,
For
Christian.
welcome.
So I'll try MRF and ALDE. I'll try to be very brief so we don't go to more than a few minutes over time. It is very interesting. It is very interesting why the MRF ended there. The only reason why MRF ended there is because the other two big parties ended with PES and with the EPP. So the only place where the MRF could place itself was ALDE. And of course, ALDE itself was looking for an agent in Bulgaria. And at that time, NDSV did not exist yet. But, you know, I have spent a lot of time working with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, which is the political foundation that supports liberals. So, you know, they have done all these seminars and trainings with the MRF. And they personally have told me there has always been a lost cause in a way, you know, to try to portray this party as a centrist liberal party. It is bogus. If you do look at their platform is well written because again, ALDE taught them how to write it. So there was this instrument in Bulgaria that at some point, how was it? The Izboru Pokazatel or something like this, where you do, you state your preferences in terms of economic, social, and whatnot. So I did this on myself. And because I'm someone who's economically right, but socially left, I ended up, the results told me that I should vote for DPS. Which was another proof, of course, that party platforms and manifestos have nothing to do with what actual parties stand for. Yeah, and that this instrument was just conceived, maybe could have worked in Denmark, but certainly not in Bulgaria. And what is the view from Brussels? Certainly in Brussels, people know what the situation is, but Brussels have bigger fish to fry, so they have to worry about Poland and Hungary. And until they have a Borisov, despite his, you know, unpolished looking character, he looks much better because he's pro-EU. And if the corruption is still there, he at least, you know, keeps it under the radar to some extent. So I think they're quite aware, but by the time anybody in Brussels manages to get to the MRF in particular, I don't see that happening. And going to the 2013 protests, I mean, this was such a slap in the face to have Delian Peevski appointed. And it is clear that this party is a corporation. It is run by a corporation. When I was in Bulgaria in, when was it? 2005, 2006, interviewing politicians. The only party I could not get to in any way was the DPS. I actually wrote my entire chapter on DPS of my dissertation based on the various ways in which I couldn't get through. You know, so you have a solid youth organization. Their party headquarters are full of those activists. They send them to study in the US and they come back. They actively promote women at the lower levels of the party. It's full of women. And I mean, it is a military organization. It is a military organization. It is so effective and they're so competent for what they want to do. You know, they get trainings in public speaking, you name it, you name it. It is unique. But at the very top, it is a corporation. So at the local level, certainly within any municipality that has a mayor or a city council dominated by MRF, you could not do anything. Nepotism goes through, as you said, teacher. You could not sell a property. You could not just have a property in a village and sell it. Agencija za gorite, so the forestry agency, again dominated. Ministry of Agriculture, again penetrated throughout, you know, the 2000s, starting with NDSV. So there are entire sectors of Bulgarian government that are entirely controlled by MRF. And any party who comes to power needs to reconcile with that, and that's what Borisov did. He couldn't open a war on them because it was impossible for him to stay on power and also have that war. So he just had this pact, and that kept things stable for him. But yes, we should not fool ourselves that the DPS doesn't hold control. Again, trying to get to a few more questions. So the Ottoman cultural heritage. I remember this big scandal. Who was it? Was it Ul Brunbauer when he declared that you know we had Ottoman presence and not the Turkish yoke, and this was such a big scandal. You know, a lot of protests today that, you know, we're not describing the Turkish yoke as a Turkish yoke. Objectively speaking, there was more religious freedom in the Ottoman Empire than in any other empire at the time. Certainly there were massacres for sure, and there were massacres in those times anywhere you lived. But you know, this empire, for many years, had the most elaborate public administration and system of registration, accounting, the collection of taxes, and so forth. So economically, you know, there was control, and everything was handled through taxation. But the religious freedom ethnic freedom was much greater than in other places. And this is something that you get lynched if you say in Bulgaria, of course, but it's factologically true. And you know, when I talked about this love-hate relationship, it is ironic because you openly state that you like Turkish culture, that you like being in Turkey, and you like Turkish food and all of that. Other people practice it, and at the same time spit nationalist rhetoric on social networks. You know? So I think that actually Bulgarians have a very, very neurotic relationship with Turkey. That there's a lot of inferiority complex going on. There's a lot of denial of historical facts. I don't see that ending, honestly, but I do think that the legacy of this Ottoman Empire is there to stay, from, you know, our language, the number of Turkish words in our language, to our cuisine, to our culture. So whether or not we spit nationalist rhetoric on social networks, I think that Bulgarians are profoundly bound with this culture, broadly speaking. Elections. There will be elections, of course, and there will be again a big fragmentation. I don't think anybody would get over 30%. I think that Продължаваме промяната, change continues, would continue to lose votes, and I think that GERB would maintain its votes. БСП may be able to maybe gain back some of its votes from change continues, but I don't see a light in the tunnel. Honestly, I don't see a light in the tunnel. What is happening is not unusual. It is not unusual that a PR system has 6 or 7 parties in parliament. What is unusual is the refusal of those parties to come together and form any kind of policy-based collaboration. If you look at Denmark or the Netherlands, there's much more parties in government, in parliament. But you know, we have this political culture that produces politicians who focus on personalist appeals and populism. So I find it quite irrational to, before each election in the last 18 months, to hear everybody think that they would get more votes in the next election. This is mathematically impossible. But yet this is what everybody's hoping for. And now Kostadinov, of course, is hoping for new elections because he thinks that he would gain ever more votes. And of course, this was what Slavi Trifonov was hoping in October, that he would get ever more votes. And where did he go? And then Maya Manolova before that was hoping for ever more votes. And where did he go? So, you know, there's a book by my friends, Tim Houghton and Kevin Deegan-Krause, called The New Party Challenge, that talks about this new party subsystem, that the moment you enter into this cycle of new parties, they breed even newer parties and even newer parties, and you really lose any kind of party system stability. And I think that Bulgaria has entered in that cycle. It's not a cycle that lasts forever. Of course, at some point, we should either end with some kind of Erdogan or Orban, we should end with some kind of maybe coalition government. Certainly doesn't end forever, but right now, if you just read the abstract of this book, I think it perfectly describes what Bulgaria is going through. I'll stop here because I think we're really out of time. And thank you for the wonderful questions.
Yes, thank you so much for answering all of those in such a concise and smart way. Like, I really learned a lot today, and I think we can all just see how complex this relationship is, how complex it's been over time, and we just will have to wait and see where it goes from here. So thank you so much for coming to Balkan Circle today, and thank you to everyone else who's come. Hope to see you all soon.